Change Summit 2025 at Hong Kong Baptist University. So my name is Sam Lau, coming from the Research Center for Environment and Human Health. My another hat is being the director of the Research Management Office. It's my honor to be the host and also the moderator for the symposium. So today we have an exceptional lineup of experts joining us to share with us their insight and expertise at this symposium. Please be reminded that the symposium will be recorded and will be uploaded to a designated YouTube channel. For participants who may not be able to join us at this time of the day, given that this symposium is open to people across the world. Today we have 4 renowned speakers with us. And to start with, we have our keynote speaker, Professor Kelly Fielding, and a professor from the School of Communication and Art, the University of Queensland, Australia. And Kelly is a professor of environmental psychology at the University of Queensland. Her research focuses on understanding and developing effective ways to communicate about climate change and environmental issues. So this talk discusses how understanding the identity of our audience who we are communicating with can help develop effective climate communication and also shape more sustainable responses to climate change. Okay, let's join us to send us a warm welcome to Kelly.
Thanks so much, Sam, and thanks so much for the invitation to speak today. I think it is a great lineup. I'm actually really looking forward to seeing the speakers who come after me, but I'll see what I can do first. Now, if I could have the next slide, please. I would like, before I go any further, to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I meet. I'm in Brisbane in Australia at the moment, so that's Meanjin, the traditional owners call that. I'd like to pay my respects to ancestors and their descendants, and to also acknowledge that the Indigenous Australians were the first environmentalists, the first protectors of our country. Next slide, please. I'd also like to thank all of the fabulous collaborators that I have. At my stage in my career, I do very little of the hard graft that's done by the PhD students and postdocs who you can see here, but I also have some fabulous collaborators who are senior as well. So I just want to give a shout out to them. They have all been instrumental and fundamental to the research I'm going to talk about today. Next slide, please. Now, anyone who's watching this or listening to this talk today, I'm pretty sure is already concerned about climate change and the environment more broadly. But I still think it's worth us reflecting on climate change and its impacts as they're happening at the moment around the world, and also to reflect on the fact that they're happening at a swifter rate than climate scientists have actually been predicting. So what we've got here are some images of climate impacts in Australia, the bushfires in 2019-2020, floods that have been happening on a fairly regular basis, but also wildfires in California. I managed to find a little slide of climate impacts that are predicted to happen in Hong Kong. So increased rainfall, increased heat, increased cyclones, etc. It's not just about these kind of extreme weather events, of course. We know that we're seeing increasing anxiety and concern around the world, especially amongst young people, and also there's the impact of climate change on pathogenic diseases. And so, next slide, please. Addressing climate change is something that is really probably the largest and most challenging task that humanity has ever faced. And so, as the slide says, it calls for nothing less than a complete transformation of how we produce, how we consume, and how we move about. We need change at the governmental level, we need it in industry, but we also need individual citizens to actually be playing their part as well. And that's what my research really focuses on. Next slide, please. Is understanding, well, what motivates people to engage with individual and collective behaviours to address climate change or to support policy to address climate change? And if we can gain that understanding, can we develop effective strategies to actually promote greater climate engagement, to develop effective climate communication? Next slide, please. So I just want to take a moment here just to talk about some terminology I'm going to use in this talk today. I'm going to use this term climate action. And I know sometimes when people use this word action, they're often thinking activism, like protest on the street, but I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about that specifically. I'm talking about climate action as a kind of shorthand to indicate the sort of individual sustainability behaviours that we can engage in, like reducing our energy use or changing our diet, through to collective climate advocacy behaviours like talking to our friends and our family and sending letters to decision makers, to try to raise awareness and try to get people more concerned and acting on climate change, through to things like voting and engaging in forms of activism. Next slide, please. I wanted to take a moment because I think that often when we talk about climate change, we focus on the fact that we're not making enough progress, not enough is happening, climate communication has failed. But I think that this study that was published last year tells us actually that we have made some progress and we have had some successes. So in this 125 country study with, a whole lot of people, when people were asked, should people try to fight global warming? You can see an overwhelming majority of people said, yeah, we should be doing that. And when they were asked, should governments be doing more to address global warming? An overwhelming majority of people said, yes, they should be. There was a somewhat smaller minority when people were asked, would you be willing to devote some of your income to to address climate change? We see that when things become more concrete, when people have to make sacrifices, that's certainly, you get less people kind of on board with that. Next slide, please. But of course, we also see data that tells us that there are proportions of people in countries around the world who are not actually on board with the climate science. So here's some data that came from a French polling company, and I'm going to point to Australia because it's the country that I'm in at the moment, where just 60% of Australians believe that climate disruption is human cause. So in other words, there's 40% of people who actually do not have beliefs that align with the climate scientists. And so a key question that this really raises is why? Why are there people who are disengaged or even disbelieving or even opposing, climate action and climate solutions? Next slide, please. So what I want to do today in my talk is to provide one explanation for that disengagement, that opposition, and then propose two ways where we could increase engagement through the use of unconventional advocates, which I'll talk about, and also narrative communication. Next slide, please. So the explanation that I'm going to focus on, and of course we have these energy saving offices, right? Which mean that if you haven't moved around enough, your lights go out, which is energy saving, but it's really annoying because what it means is that if you haven't moved around enough, you have to go over here and kind of wave your arms around and get the lights to come on again, which is what I've just had to do. Apologies. Back to what I was saying. So there are a lot of different explanations for, why people are disengaged or opposed, but the one that I want to focus on today is the role of identity. And so this is some data from some research, a meta-analysis actually that we did a few years ago. So a meta-analysis of all the research about climate change beliefs from around the, from research from around the world. And what you can see here is that one of the strongest predictors amongst these demographic predictors was people's political affiliation. So whether or not they were conservative or progressive in terms of the political party that they voted for, people are more conservative, have less belief in climate change. Now, I realize that link between political identity and climate change beliefs is quite kind of country specific. So especially in places like Australia and the US, you see that kind of linkage. Next slide, please. But what I want to, the point I'm trying to make with this very busy slide, which comes out of some research that one of my PhD students is actually just done and is under review, is to say, well, there are other kinds of identity groups that are also related to environmental and climate change engagement. So let me sort of do a bit of decoding of this busy slide. So this is a latent profile analysis that we did drawing on data from the International Social Science Program. So we've got data from Australia, from New Zealand, and from the US, countries that have similar sociocultural backgrounds. And what we can see on this slide is that we've got this group of disengaged skeptics. So these are people who don't believe in climate change and not in any way engaged, in any sort of environmental action. And consistent with research that we've already seen, these are mainly men who are, kind of Anglo-Australians and who are right-leaning. Up the other end, you've got those environmental activists, so they believe in climate change and they're out there doing everything that they can to address it. And these are more likely to be women, to be highly educated, and to be, progressive in their politics. But you also have these other groups like the disengaged believers. They kind of believe in climate change, but they're not really doing anything about it. And they're more likely to have children, to be from migrant backgrounds, to be a little bit religious. So the key point I'm trying to make with this slide is that there are a number of different kinds of identities, sometimes intersecting with each other, and they help to shape, or they're certainly related to, people's environmental and climate change engagement. Next slide, please. So when we're trying to think about how we can explain the link between identity and climate change engagement, climate change attitudes and behaviours, then, we can look to the social identity approach. And so I'm using this term, the social identity approach, to encompass two theories. We've got social identity theory, which was originally a theory of intergroup relations, and self-categorization theory, which really elaborates more on the kind of cognitive processes that happen when we identify with a particular group. And so a number of scholars around the world are focusing on how the social identity approach can help to explain people's climate change and environmental attitudes and behaviours, not just us here in Australia, but colleagues in Europe, as well as in North America as well. I want to make a couple of kind of theoretical points because I know that some people will be familiar with this theory, this theoretical approach, but other people won't. So if we could go to the next slide. And so one of the core propositions from this theoretical approach is that when we're thinking about ourselves in terms of a particular group identity, then the values and norms of that identity are going to guide our attitudes and behavior. So if I'm thinking about myself as in terms of an environmentalist, and I do think about myself in that way, then my attitudes and behavior are guided by the norms and values of that particular identity. So to give you a really concrete example, I'm here in Meanjin, Brisbane, but I live up in the Sunshine Coast hinterland. And so I could hop in my car and I could drive all the way to campus, but that would really it'd be kind of annoying to be on the roads all that way. But most importantly, it would really be problematic from the perspective that I'm an environmentalist, and I would be, using up a lot of carbon emissions just to get to work. So what I do is I take a much longer route. I go down to the train station, I hop on the train, then I hop on a bus and I get to campus. It's quite a lengthy trip, but, at least I can be sure that I am doing something that is, not violating my environmentalist identity. So that core proposition is that we're going to be guided, that our attitudes and behaviors will be guided by, our ideas about what our identity approves of and, what we value. And in the next slide, I'm going to point to a second core proposition, which is when we are identifying as a member of a group, we show in-group bias. We just like other people who are our in-group members more. We trust them more. We are more persuaded by them. The example I have here is, the group of dog lovers and cat lovers. I fall into the dog lover camp. If I'm talking to somebody who is a cat lover and they're trying to tell me something about dogs, I'm like, what do they know about dogs? And are they really, do they really dislike? I just am not going to trust what they tell me about dogs. But if I'm talking to somebody who's a fellow dog lover, I'm going to be much more open to what they have to say. And of course, those kind of processes don't just, work for cat lovers and dog lovers, but, for members of lots of different groups, especially when those groups have some kind of history of conflict. Next slide, please. So there's I think a building, a developing research and evidence base for the link between these collective identity processes and climate change and environmental attitudes and behaviours. I just wanted to point to one of my own studies just as a really nice illustration of how the source of the information, where those messages come from, can really have a big impact on, on their effects. And so we wanted to look at this in the context of climate solutions, a carbon tax and nuclear energy. And we wanted to look at a situation in which there's very polarized in-group, out-group sort of situations. So I think we would all be familiar with the fact that in the US, it's very much the case that Democrats are very supportive of climate change is happening and it needs to be addressed. And that's much less the case amongst Republican voters. So we did this study where we, recruited people who were supported, Democrat or Republican voters into these two experimental studies. I'm just going to talk today about the one that relates to the carbon tax, and we presented them with information about a carbon tax that was aligned with the values of their political identity. So, promoted on the basis of Republican or Democrat values, and where that carbon tax was said to be supported by other Democrats or other Republicans. Now, if we look at the data on the next slide, we can see that we measured actually support for the carbon tax before we gave them the information about the carbon tax, as well as afterwards. And what you can see is that when they receive information that the Democrat Party support the carbon tax, people who are themselves Democrat Democrat voters, their support for the carbon tax actually increases. People who are Republican participants, that has no effect on them. On the other hand, when Republican participants read that the Republican Party support a carbon tax, you can see that leads to an increase in support. It doesn't have much of an impact on Democrat participants. And we saw this same pattern of results for other dependent variables, carbon tax attitudes and behavioural intentions in relation to a carbon tax. If we go to the next slide. Now, so basically what those findings suggest is that if we want to try to, engage people, to get them on board in terms of addressing climate change, we just need to get in-group members to reach out to other in-group members to actually to convince them to do that. But the problem is a lot of the communication about climate change comes from environmental groups, from international NGOs, from climate scientists, from conventional, kind of the usual suspects. And so one of the strategies that we have seen already happening in Australia, but also in other places around the world, is for what we're calling unconventional climate advocacy groups to reach out to their own groups to try to convince them that climate change is something that needs to be addressed and supported and engaged with. We can go to the next slide. So just to do some definitions. On the next slide. So conventional climate advocates, these are people, they're groups, that are, they're the kind of Greenpeace and the WWFs of the world. They are aligned with, stereotypical environmentalist identities. We expect to hear people from those groups advocate for climate change. Unconventional climate advocacy groups, on the other hand, or people, are where they're members of groups that we don't sort of either think about their identities as being aligned with climate change, or even sometimes they're part of groups who you think, well, they might be in conflict with environmentalists. And so the question we're trying to address with this research is, can these unconventional advocates build a broader support base for climate action through changing the norms of their in-groups and through increasing the number and types of groups who support climate action, and thereby, increase the broader support within the community? If we go to the next slide, I'm going to just give you some examples of what I mean by these unconventional advocacy groups. Now, these are Australian examples, but I'm pretty sure, I know that these sorts of groups exist in countries around the world. And so these role-based examples, these are where these people and groups are advocating for climate action on the basis of being a parent, you know, that they're saying we need to have a healthy planet for the future of our children. You know, doctors are saying, you know, if we don't have a healthy planet, then we can't actually be healthy ourselves. Vets are making a claim for the need for climate action because they care about not just humans, but all animals. And then on the next slide, you'll see that we have what we're calling conflict spanning examples. So these are groups where there's traditionally been a kind of conflict between the group and environmentalists. So certainly in Australia, probably in many, I think in many countries around the world, farmers and environmentalists often haven't seen eye to eye. Another example I can pull out here is the investor group on climate change. You know, people are interested in commerce and investment. You know, usually the kind of dichotomy is environment versus economy, whereas here as a group is saying, well, look, you know, if we want to have a secure and less risky investment environment, we have to address climate change. So let me just give you a kind of whistle-stop tour of some research that we've been doing about these unconventional climate advocacy groups. If we go to the next slide, the first thing that we did was to map how these groups connect to other climate advocacy groups. And so we actually mapped the connections between over 3,000 climate advocacy groups in Australia. We did this by looking at their websites and their Facebook pages. And this very, I guess, kind of busy social network map that you can see here, the thing to point out is that the green dots are for those role-based, you know, the parents, the, you know, doctors, the vets, unconventional climate advocacy groups. The red dots are those conflict spanning. So they're the investors and the farmers. And what you can see is they're really sitting on the periphery of the climate advocacy movement. And we think that that's not necessarily a bad thing, because if your group is not really looking to environmental groups as, you know, as a group that, you know, you want to align your group with, you know, if you kind of go, oh, those environmentalists, you know, they're a bit, you know, radical, or, you know, they don't really care about our group and what the interests of our group, then, you know, aligning with those sorts of groups is not necessarily a good thing. So being on the periphery of the climate advocacy movement could actually be something that works in your favor. On the next slide, I'll just briefly point to some data where we actually looked at the media coverage of these unconventional climate advocacy groups. So we looked at over 17,000 Australian media articles between 2017 and 2020. This little graph over here, I mean, just kind of ignore the kind of the different media outlets, because that's very Australian specific. But what it does show is that there's a lot of coverage of those established groups, the Greenpeace, the WWF. There is some coverage of those disruptive groups. That's the sort of XR type groups, especially at News Corp, which is the sort of Murdoch media. There's a lot less coverage of those unconventional climate advocacy groups, which of course I'm sure they would like to have more coverage. But what is really interesting about the coverage that they actually get is that it's positive and sympathetic to them. So where they are getting that media coverage, it is working in their favor. Whereas what's often the case with the more conventional advocacy groups is that, you know, where they're getting that media coverage, it's sometimes, you know, very stigmatizing sort of coverage, especially from certain types of news outlets. If we go to the next slide, this is some research done by one of the PhD students who's working in our project, Sarah Boddington, and she went out and actually interviewed people who were leaders and founders of these groups. And so I've got some examples there, because these were groups and people who said, we don't mind, we're happy for you to talk explicitly about who we are and what we do. So this is Farmers for Climate Action, Investor Group on Climate Change, and Frontrunners, who are a group who are about athletes and climate change. And if you look over to the right, what you'll see is evidence of what we're calling identity leadership. So This is about changing who we are and what we stand for. And the sort of strategies that are being used by these groups are to get prototypical spokespeople. By that, I mean somebody, if you're thinking about the Farmers for Climate Action, you don't want to get a farmer who nobody knows, nobody respects. You want to have a farmer out there as your spokesperson who is seen to be a real farmer and somebody who's successful and somebody who people respect. And then people are much more likely to take them seriously. You don't want them to be a kind of fringe sort of person. They're being supported through training and through people to sort of offer them, some backup. And they're making their arguments based on the group. So the Farmers for Climate Action, say that they want there to be farming forever. They want to make sure that there is, a future for farmers in Australia. And obviously, groups around the world are wanting the same thing. But they're also trying to make sure that they're not moving too far ahead of their group. So they need to make sure that the sort of arguments they're making are still aligned with, the position of the group. So the final kind of aspect of this research I want to talk about, if we go to the next slide, is where we went out to to ordinary Australians to find out what they think about these unconventional climate advocacy groups. So the postdoc on this project, Zhongji Wang, who's my former PhD student, went to Brisbane. Was in Brisbane at the time, and then also went out to regional areas in Queensland and just basically kind of went up to people in public areas and asked them if they would be part of the research. And, what we got was, people who would not normally take part in research. So very much more ordinary Australians than you might get from, a panel or people who kind of sign up to be part of research panels. And he showed them a number of different, unconventional advocacy groups and descriptions of them and asked them, which of these do you think you would support? If we go to the next slide, we can see a bit of a heat map where we can see that there's a lot of support for, firefighters and farmers and vets and sort of less for other groups. Because it was a situation where we're in short interviews with people, they were giving us explanations for their choices. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that. That the sort of reasoning that people gave us is like, well, I don't identify with this group because I'm a farmer myself. They were more supportive and chose groups where they thought that there was a relevance of the group to climate change. So, firefighters, they're the people at the forefront of having to fight the impacts of climate change. And groups where they thought that the motivations were authentic, so if they are firefighters, they have, it makes sense that they would want to actually try to prevent there being, fires and bushfires in the future. Whereas the investor group, they were kind of like, not sure about that investor group because, is it just about money? So that's all I want to say about these unconventional advocates at this stage. So I guess the kind of key point here is that I think our data show that these groups are really working to try to change the way their in-group members, think about climate change and, the relevance of climate change and whether they're acting on climate change. And there is the potential for these groups to have, wider impacts in society. I want to move on now, though, to talk about a different way that we might go about engaging people with climate change. So those people who are disengaged or even those people who might be opposed. If we move to the next slide, and that's a more kind of creative approach to getting people to identify and engage with climate change. And that's a sort of storytelling or narrative approach. And anyone who's paying attention to the climate communication literature will see that there's a lot of rhetoric and discourse about how, well, the current approaches, they've gotten us so far, but they're not cutting through, they're not having the impact that we would want, and we need these different approaches, and maybe we need a kind of more narrative and storytelling approach. And if we go to the next slide, then we can see that one of the reasons why I think people are kind of hanging their hat on these kind of power of narratives is because as a species, we are storytellers. We have been telling stories as a way to pass along information across human history. And the thing about narratives, right, is somebody is trying to convince you of something, you're kind of readying yourself with your rebuttal. But if someone tells you a story, then you're defenses go down, and you're like, oh, what happens next, and what happens next? And so, you know, you start to identify with the characters, and you get transported into the world of the story. And so certainly within the health space, these narrative interventions have been shown to increase health screening and health promotion behaviours. And there's potential for perhaps this approach to have similar effects in relation to environment and climate change, but the empirical base is actually currently very small. So with that in mind, I set out with one of my PhD students to test the power of this kind of narrative approach to climate change communication. If we go to the next slide. So we ran an experiment where we had 3 different experimental conditions. So we had a climate story. I'll talk a bit about that in a moment. Or people were randomly assigned to a climate fact sheet condition where they saw the same kind of information, but just in a fact sheet style. Or they read a story, but it was nothing to do with climate change. And we focused on young adults because the story was about young adults. And then after they, you know, got one of these experimental conditions, then they were asked questions about their behavioural intentions, climate policy support. And we also asked them some open-ended questions that allowed us to get a bit of insight to how they responded to the story. So we go to the next story, the next slide, I should say. It is sort of the next story. So one of the things we worked out very early on in this research is that it's actually really hard to write a good story. Creative writing is much harder than you might think. And so the bonus is that I sit in a school where I have colleagues who are creative writers. And so we went to one of the PhD students who's a published author and said, would you write us a story? And so she did write us a great story. It's very engaging. And it's a story about young adults who are dealing with a flooding event in Brisbane. There's been a number of these floods in recent years in Brisbane. And, you know, they lose a cat, you know, and then they have to find the cat. And as the story, you know, unfolds, there's a lot of discussion about climate change and different perspectives. And so, you know, they go on a bit of a journey with these flatmates. And so, as I said, after they got that story, or one of the other conditions, are asked a number of dependent variables. If we go to the next slide, what we found was we only found that climate story had an impact on one of our dependent variables. So we need to treat these findings with caution. So what we found was that those people who got the climate story had increased or higher, I shouldn't say increased, higher difficult behavioral intention. So they were more likely to be willing to do things like change their diet, or talk to people about climate change. But it didn't have that impact on the sort of easy behavioral intentions. As I said before, we also collected some qualitative data. And if we go to the next slide, then we can see that the sort of things that people said about the climate story as well, you know, sort of indicated that, you know, that they related to the story, that it seemed authentic to them. And so you can see from this quote, you know, I felt very sympathetic to a couple of the characters in the story. You know, they're saying things that I've heard very often from people I know and I love. If we look at the next slide, the story also got them to reflect on climate change, or what's, you know, on the impacts of climate change. And if we look at the next slide, it also got them to reflect on the need for climate action. And so even though we didn't get the kind of strong results that we might have wanted to get, you know, not that we particularly want, you know, to get anything in particular, but, you know, it's nice to kind of get significant results, isn't it? Still, I think these qualitative comments give us a bit of insight into what a story might need to do in order to be effective. I also think that, you know, these kind of one-off, you know, climate communication interventions, you know, can only go so far in, you know, engaging people, and that, you know, what you need to really have, you know, bigger effects is interventions that, you know, or stories that happen over time, and that get, you know, that mirror what we experience experience in the real world, which is to come across different stories at different times that, have the same kind of message. Now I'm going to have to hop up and go and jump around and get the lights to work again. And that's fine because there's no way for me to actually kind of get around that, by the way. I just have to do it. If we go to the next slide, I'm just going to kind of wrap up what I've been saying to this point in time. So to kind of sum up on one slide, what I've spent the last sort of 30 or so minutes talking about, certainly there's growing evidence that the identities that we have, the ways we're thinking about ourselves, the groups that we're part of, can really impact or be related to, at the very least, how we think about climate change, whether we are engaged or whether we are not with climate change, whether we think it's happening and people are causing it or not. There's an increasing evidence base to support that role of collective identities in relation to climate change attitudes and behaviours. I've pointed to these unconventional climate advocates as just one way in which we can reach out to in-group members and change the relevance, whether or not the identity is related to climate change, for those identities that, it might just not, make that much sense, whether they're actually related or not, or where those identities, those groups have actually been in opposition to environmentalists. As I said before, we don't have, we've got some kind of nascent evidence for the power of narratives, but clearly there's a lot more research that's needed in that space. Now, in my final slide, I just want to kind of, because this is a symposium on bridging environment and health and sustainability, I wanted to really just kind of link back into health and say, I've been talking about the role of identities and groups and how they can help to encourage climate action. But of course, my colleagues here at the University of Queensland have also pointed to the important role that identities and identifying with particular groups can have for well-being. So there can be that co-benefit that if we identify with groups such as Farmers for Climate Action, we can also, have some, well-being benefits of that identification. And there's a recent meta-analysis that also points to some studies that show a positive association between engaging in pro-environmental behaviour and subjective well-being. So I'm going to finish there. Hopefully I have managed to kind of keep it within the time that I was allotted and just finish by thanking everyone for listening, putting up with me jumping around to get the lights going, and ask for any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelly, for your wonderful sharing. And there's a lot insights that we can learn. And now is the time for Q&A. So it's perfect timing. We've got 9 minutes for the Q&A before we head to the next section. And so let me start with the question. Yeah, for the takeaway messages, and let me mirror your example, Doctors for the Environment Australia. So I was wondering if we could set up a lot more unconventional groups like Teachers for the Environment Hong Kong, Parents for the Nature Australia, perhaps. So and I think this is a very a good way to look into how we can communicate climate change to the wider audience. The first question that I would like to ask is there any in between, say conventional, unconventional? Is there any groups that could be both?
Both. Okay. Well, I think, as I said before, I think one of the problems with with a kind of overlap is that if you are part of a group where, one of the kind of problems with that environmentalist identity or those kind of environmentalist groups is often when if you ask people to think about an environmentalist or an environmentalist group, they'll often think about some of the more radical groups like Extinction Rebellion or those who kind of disruptive environmental groups. And so for some people, not everyone, of course, but for some people, the issue with being aligned with an environmentalist group is that it can be a turnoff for some people. They're like, oh, that's not me. I would never want to do those sorts of things. And so, that I think is one reason why, you're looking to the groups that people do belong to, and that maybe don't currently have an association with climate change, but trying to craft that association with climate change. Because, if you think about it, it does make sense. So if you're a parent, it does make sense that you would care about climate change because you want to have, a planet that is going to sustain the future of your children and your grandchildren. If you are a farmer, it does make sense to care about climate change because, those climate impacts are really going to make farming a very tenuous occupation and make, for some people is a generations it's something they've been doing for generations. And so, if it's going to undermine the viability for future generations, it makes sense to actually go, wow, we really need to take notice of this and do something about it. So I think that the reason to kind of maybe not have the overlap is because, you want to avoid in some cases kind of being, and I'm using this word tainted, sort of advisedly, because I don't think that environmentalist groups, taint others, but I think that for some group members to be too closely associated with those conventional advocacy groups could be something that they think will be a turnoff for their group members. So I hope that that's an answer to your question.
Yeah. It's actually lead me to think of another question, a follow-up question. So, so you mentioned when people heard about environmental group, they may think of them, oh, they're more radical. And in case that we would like to set up a group, Teachers for the Environment Hong Kong. So how can we coin ourselves? If we couldn't coin ourselves environmental group?
Oh, but I mean, the thing is, it's like it's fine for you to be for the environment, right? Okay. But, it's really more about, whether you're connecting using the same language or messages as those conventional environmental groups, I think. So, one of the things that Sarah showed in her study when she talked to all those founders and those leaders of those unconventional advocacy groups is that they were very careful to make their arguments on the basis of their own group identity, to not kind of, because the thing about environmentalist groups is, and there's a lot of research, I think, to sort of speak to this, is they're often making the arguments on the basis of certain kinds of values and values that are about protecting the environment. Whereas with many of these groups, yes, of course, it's about protecting the environment. It's protecting the environment so that we can keep farming, addressing climate change so we can keep farming. And so I guess the thing about, it's protecting the planet so humans can be healthy is what the doctors would argue. And so, it's making the case on the basis of what your group cares about. And they might not inherently or care about the environment, but they do care about the future of their group and their group members.
I see. Okay, thank you so much, Kelly. And so we still have a few more minutes just to see if there are any questions via the Zoom or on-site. Wonderful. I think we got a question from an on-site participant.
Oh, wow. Fabulous.
Oh, maybe. Is it on? Kelly, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Sure.
Oh, great. Okay, and apologies if I'm covering something or asking something that's already been covered. I arrived late. I flew in to Hong Kong with my colleague from the United Kingdom earlier. Anyway.
Oh,
Kelly,
exciting to be there though, right?
Yeah, it's great. It's really great to be here. Virtual's great, but there's nothing like the affective learning process as well. I think, we need to, balance it out. So a couple of things from me. One was the last bit of your talk, and you were talking about Extinction Rebellion, using them as an example, and that some people may be put off by that, the nature of the sort of the disruptive element and maybe the tainting element. Well, I think that increasingly in space, young people, just very people who care about their futures, are being they're finding it increasingly difficult to speak up, for fear of, you know, being put on some list. I mean, Extinction Rebellion would be, you know, the classic example. And sometimes maybe the response to that, police tactics, I'm thinking of France in particular, can be a real turnoff. And young people can say, do you know, that's too much, I'm not going to get involved, so that they stand back from that climate action.
I'm so sorry, but you cut out right at the end. So I think I might have not heard the actual question that you asked. So I apologize. I'm on the university campus, so it shouldn't get any better in terms of the internet connection. But still, I didn't actually catch
We
that.
invite you to join here. Sorry. How about we invite the speaker to come again? Is it clear? May we ask? Is the voice
Yeah,
clear?
I can. It might have been. It might have been the
Oh, so
microphone.
Kelly, sorry, just the last bit. Yeah, the thunder at the end was in the context of virtual exchange and collaborative online international learning. This is also a plug to come to my talk tomorrow about navigating the boundaries of virtual exchange. One of them, of course, is around ultimately sort of a freedom of speech to explore, you know, climate action, not just climate action as a substantive topic area, but the depths of the things that surround it. And of course, we are all boundaried culturally, politically, policy-wise. So how do you negotiate that within a virtual space and still remain sort of respectful within a different cultural context? That's the first one. The second one is, I'm very interested, Kelly, in your work, because myself and some colleagues at the University of Gloucestershire, which is in a very rural area of the United Kingdom, we've just put in for £1.5 million pound grant to what's the National Lottery, to actually look at climate action in the context of disadvantaged and physically and mentally challenged sort of communities. And I'm hoping to not just be involved in the monitoring and the evaluation, but most importantly, the learning. And I'm going to be using theatre in education, a sort of theatre approach where we play back those sort of scenarios. And so my second question would be, I wonder, in the context of virtual exchange and CWIL practices, what role there is potentially for that role play, for theatre, for play. How might we, because it is a very affective learning process, how can we somehow bring that into the virtual space? I hope that's okay. I'll leave those two. Thank you, Kelly.
I don't know. I don't very often get tripped up by questions, but I have to say, I don't think I am well placed to talk about the kind of virtual exchange space. So these are really great questions, really interesting questions that I simply do not have answers to. So all I can say is I hope your talk goes well. And I'll try to make it if I can. And yeah, I guess that, and it's great to hear about these other kind of creative approaches, because I do think that, you know, what we need is, you know, there's no silver bullet, you know, so there's no kind of one kind of strategy that's going to engage everybody, that's actually going to, reach out to everyone. So, you know, really what we need is a kind of, and I hope that this is what I kind of emphasized in my own talk, is that the need for different groups through different channels, through different creative and factual processes, can hopefully deepen the level of engagement and action in countries around the world. I think that's what we need. But I don't think that I can address the virtual part of your questions, and I apologize for that.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Thanks, Kelly.
Yeah, in view of the time, let's us move on. Thank you so much again, Kelly, for your inspiring speech, and thanks for the audience for the fruitful exchanges. So coming up, the second speaker of the today symposium, we have Professor Maria Ojala, who will be talking on the young people and climate change. What conflicts do young people experience when trying to live more climate friendly, and how do they cope? So Maria is a professor in socio-ecological resilience at the Front Program, University of Lulu, right? Finland. She has a PhD in psychology and also worked as associate professor at Åbro University, Sweden. Her research focuses on how young people think, feel, and learn and communicate about global environmental problems, with a specific focus on climate change. Young people are vital to include in society efforts to mitigate climate change. This talk focuses on what kinds of conflicts young people who want to live more climate-friendly experience and how they cope and deal with these conflicts and related emotions. What we can learn from this research regarding climate change education and communication will be elaborated on. Okay, let me pass the time to Maria. Thank you again.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction, and I'm gonna share my screen. And there it's in presentation mode. Thank you for inviting me. And indeed, I'm gonna talk about young people and climate change. What conflicts do young people experience, and how do they cope with these conflicts? And a short background, I have been doing research together with my colleagues for over 15 years about young people and how they relate to global crisis, especially climate change as an existential threat. And I have focused on young people from the age of 11 years old through the teenage years to young adulthood. And I have mainly studied emotional reactions and how young people cope with climate change anxiety, worry, for instance, and how these coping strategies relate to different kinds of engagement, collective engagement, but also what Kelly was talking about, small things that you do in everyday life. I have also looked at relationship to mental well-being and communication patterns with teacher and parents. And hope has been a main kind of concept that I have dealt with, both empirically in qualitative and quantitative studies, but also theoretically. And it's going to be a part of this presentation also, although it's not part of the title. Because there seems to be some studies indicating that a sort of hopelessness seems to be spreading among young people concerning the global future, and particularly in relation to climate change. Or at least it is a kind of helplessness and disempowerment. We actually do not know that much about what this hopelessness stands for, since most studies focus on anxiety and worry that could be rather constructive forces in engaging young people. But hopelessness potentially could be, for instance, a threat to learning. If it is the case, as some studies indicate, that young people feel that the world will go under in 30 years' time, then why should you bother learning about climate change? Because learning is takes time and it's bothersome sometimes. And of course, if you don't learn, it could be a threat to our ability as society to mitigate the climate change problem, but also to adapt to climate change. Because young people are one important stakeholder group. They are citizens of today and can influence through their choices and through being influencers. But they are also the future leaders of society. So we need them on board, so to speak. And this hopelessness could also potentially be a threat to general mental well-being. One study that I conducted with 11, 12 years old showed that if you are worried about climate change, there is not such a strong relationship to general low mental well-being. But if you feel hopelessness, this relationship is stronger, and there is a mental health crisis going on among young people today. And of course, it could also, some theoreticians argue that it could be a threat to democracy at large, because if you feel that the future is doomed, then you perhaps just focus on yourself and your own kind of pleasure and so on, or you get drawn into extremist group, and that could be a threat to democracy at large. So the solution is often to promote hope in, for example, education for a sustainable future. And then one can ask, and I have done so in my studies, how can we go about promoting a constructive kind of hope among young people? Because hope could be also less constructive in the sense that it's based on denial of the seriousness of climate change or built on unrealistic sources of hope. And what I have argued in my work is that we, in this process, cannot deny the difficult reality. Because I have done some studies with teachers, and there is a tendency among some teachers to not want to touch upon the difficult things related to climate change. When they're talking about hope, they kind of skip to hope very quickly and kind of promote a shallow kind of hope where you kind of say that everything will be fixed as long as you, for instance, recycle or something like that. And that could be dangerous because that could increase the cynicism against the, concerning the adult world that many young people have. So instead, we need to, in education, actually talk about the emotions that many young people feel about climate change, like worry, anxiety, and anger and hopelessness. And that is something that I have worked with a lot. But today I'm going to focus on the second aspect, and that is many young people do want to live more sustainably in everyday life. And when you do that, we often skip the fact that it's kind of difficult to live sustainable in a more or less non-sustainable society. And there will be a lot of conflicts and a lot of negative emotions related to that. And we need to, I argue in this presentation, include this also in education and in communication with young people. And when I'm going to talk about this, I'm actually going to argue that to deal with these conflicts in a constructive way could be a part of feeling hope. And just a basic definition of hope before I start with my talking about my studies, because there is a lot of different definitions, and but hope is actually just about perceiving a possibility for something desirable to come true. So it is related to uncertainty. It's just a feeling that you can at least do something about climate change. And if we are certain, we are talking about optimism, not hope. And optimism is rather unrealistic, but hope then could be much more realistic, because of course we could do a lot of things still to mitigate climate change and to adapt. So when I'm talking about hope, I often refer back to Snyder's hope theory. It's a well-known theory about hope in psychology. And Rick Snyder, who created it, argued that hope consists of goals, it consists of pathways, and it consists of agency thinking. And I'm going to go through this quickly, the two first. Desirable goals, to be in the context of climate change, to be able to imagine and have stories, as Kelly talked about stories about a more sustainable future, is very important. But studies show that young people are not used of talking about the global future in this way. They're used of focusing on negative aspects, and they have a hard time coming up with, how do I imagine a more sustainable society? And many researchers are working with this today, very important research, together with, for instance, museums, theaters, artists, and so on, that try to help young people to imagine more sustainable futures. And that is one important part of hope, but not enough, argues Snyder. We also need to come up with pathways, different ways to reach this desirable, more sustainable future. And as Kelly just talked about, it needs to be diverse. We need to, yes, focus on the global climate change movement, for instance. Many young people who feel hope in my and my colleagues' research talk about that they have trust in the climate change movement. But it could also be to have trust in technological development, to have met at least one politician that take climate change seriously, and to know different ways that I can be active concerning climate change. When we have a kind of then, as a teacher, for instance, we have talked about desirable futures, and we have identified pathways, and one student come to us and say, now I feel that there is a possibility for change, actually, and I have found one pathway. I want to make more climate-friendly food choices. And then we are perhaps very happy and feel that, oh, now we can leave this student. But what I argue is that we often forget about this third aspect of hope, namely agency thinking. When we start to act climate friendly or more sustainable, it's then the hard work starts. We need to constantly work with motivation to use the identified pathway, because difficulties will occur. And this is an ongoing process that never stops. So therefore, I have changed the naming of this agency thinking and instead call it agency work. And I argue that it is a kind of practice-based hope. So together with colleagues, I have explored how people who are highly climate active, but also those who are just interested in climate change, cope with difficulties of trying to live in a sustainable manner in a more or less unsustainable society. So what conflicts do they experience, and what are the emotions they feel in relation to these conflicts? And how do they deal with the conflicts and the emotions that I sometimes call border tensions, because they show the border between the sustainable and the unsustainable. And if you use these emotions in education, you could also then touch upon the relation between the personal and the structural and the political also. So hope in this way of looking at it is to constructively deal with these difficulties, so-called agency work, kind of practice-based hope. If we look a little bit closer at these studies that I have mainly conducted in a Swedish context, what conflicts do young people who want to live more climate-friendly, make more climate-friendly food choices, save energy, and so on, experience? Interpersonal conflicts are very common. So you're getting conflicts with your parents who don't want to buy vegan food or make vegan food, for instance. You're getting conflicts with your friends who think you're silly. And of course, to get accepted by your friends is very important in the teenage years and early adulthood, so that could be rather bothersome. It could also be internal conflicts, that you feel that you cannot live up to your ideals. You get tempted to eat meat, for instance. And then there could be also structural, practical barriers. And I should say that it often stays at a practical level. So young people feel that to buy climate-friendly food, it's too expensive, and they don't connect it to the structural or more political level. Lack of knowledge is actually, surprisingly enough, even in Sweden, where they have a lot of knowledge about climate change and what to do, but they still again and again say that they have a lack of knowledge. They want to know the relationship in a better way between these small actions and the big problem. What happens in between? So we need to actually not skip over this important part. When it comes to energy saving, many said that they felt control in everyday life. There is a lot of technology measuring your energy consumption, and they felt like they were controlled in their safe haven, their home, and this was not a positive feeling. There were also health-related conflicts related to food choices. Young girls who have a low iron value, how can they kind of get good enough food if you exercise a lot, and so on. And finally, the most common conflict was a conflict related to low outcome expectancy. So you can have good knowledge, you do not have conflicts with your parents or friends, but you still feel, and this is very common, that my actions do not really count in the big whole. And in a sense, that is true. But how can you cope with this in order to still be active? Because at a aggregated level, it of course matters how we act in our lifestyle issues. And together with colleagues, we have identified 2 different ways of dealing with conflicts, or many different ways, but 2 main different ways among young people who feel these conflicts and want to live more sustainable. And the first one is common in qualitative studies among those who do not do that much. And this is black and white thinking. So it's a way of talking about the conflicts that is either or not. So they exaggerate the conflicts. For instance, they argue if not everyone is climate friendly, there is no point in me doing anything. If not every country take climate change seriously, then it's no point in Sweden taking this problem seriously. If I'm not perfect all the time, then it's no point in me doing anything. And this way of thinking has been identified in other fields of psychology, and it has been found to lead to feelings of hopelessness, sometimes even to depression. But there are other ways to cope, and 2 ways are dialectical and deontological thinking. So dialectical thinking, these are also perceiving the conflicts. Yes, I know that it's good to do this, eating more climate friendly, but I feel that it doesn't really matter. But then they transcend these conflicts by a third element, arguing, for instance, but I can at least be a role model. I can inspire others. Someone needs to take the first step. Yes, my friends are not doing much, but I know that others are at an aggregated level. We will have an influence. If I'm not perfect all the time, yesterday I ate some meat, I can still try, and so on. Deontological thinking is more that they don't focus on the consequences, but they argue that I need to do the right thing, even though nobody else does that. So we have put this into service studies, 3 with studies in Sweden with late adolescents and young adults. We have 1 study in Spain going on and 1 in Finland also. And we have found that if you use this black and white thinking, the less inclined you are to actually act climate friendly. So this is more quantitative studies. So it seems to be this negative force. But the dialectical thinking is that the more you use that, the more you act climate friendly also. And we find that these results hold also when controlling for well-known predictors of climate friendly actions like gender, social norms, knowledge, and so So it seems to be a potent predictors, especially dialectical thinking. And also dialectical thinking actually narrow the knowledge behavior gap. So we know that you can have knowledge, but you still do not act. But if you use this dialectical thinking, then this gap narrows. So one could argue that to promote dialectical thinking in school would be good, and to kind of talk critically about this black and white thinking that we often use. But we also need to take account of emotions, this hopelessness concerning these conflicts regarding outcome expectancy, but also other emotions related to interpersonal and internal conflicts. Because young people feel a lot of emotions, but they are very individualized. They are about oneself, like guilt when you cannot live up to your ideals, or anger, not concerning politicians, but more about anger towards your parents and friends. And this can be rather difficult, actually, for the young people. And when they cope with these emotions, they don't use guilt's kind of motivating force to do something good, but they instead cope mainly by distancing. So they kind of not think about their emotions, they do something else, they push it away. So again, of course, we can kind of use these emotional reactions in the classroom and talk about them. And I have written some articles about critical emotional awareness. And this is that we need to talk about these emotions in the classroom in a critical way. Guilt, for instance, how can that be used to a constructive kind of engagement? But also how much responsibility is actually should fall upon young people? Should we not aim our anger towards politicians, and could we go together and change society in a bigger way? So this is very important to talk about in the classroom. So conclusion, just shortly. If wanting to promote a more hopeful outlook and action concerning the global future among young people, we cannot skip over conflicts and negative emotions. We should not put our negative emotions on young people, but they are already there. So we need to lift them to the surface, help young people put words on them, and include them in education. And also this practical experience. You cannot leave young people there, but include them and include the conflicts that they experience. And we need to have serious existential and critical discussions about emotions in relation to climate change, anxiety, and hopelessness, but also to these conflicts that you experience in everyday life. Educators then, of course, need to be given opportunity in teacher education, for instance, to learn about emotions, not only from a clinical perspective, but emotions are normal reactions that we all have that could be motivational forces and are important for learning. So to learn about them from a broader perspective, and also from a critical perspective from social science in general, to understand how different actors try to influence our emotions. And then we should perhaps promote dialectical thinking and challenge black and white thinking in education. And together with the doctoral student, Sonja Palmer, we are working with this, and we will conduct some kind of intervention studies in the future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much, Maria, for your inspiring speech. Okay, so we have a few minutes for the Q&A, just to see if we have any questions from the Zoom or on-site. Okay, let me start with the first question. So at the end, the last line, Maria, you mentioned that we cannot skip the conflicts and negative emotion. From time to time, we hear that the young people already fear about the climate change and the consequences. I think they are well aware of the negative impact on the environment and health due to climate change. And if we promote the negative emotion, would it add to their already worsening well-being or mental health?
Yeah, as I also said, yes, young people are already feeling a lot of negative emotions concerning climate change. So it's not about just focusing on the negative, of course not, but it is about actually acknowledging that and not coming up with the simple solutions that the young people will see through, especially if you are a teenager, young adult, you will see it through if you give some happy, clippy kind of solution that is not realistic. So we need to have these more existential discussions with young people, and that is something that young people have always been interested in, and now we can relate it to climate change also. We can of course not stop there. We cannot get caught into rumination. Then we need to, like I was talking about, this dialectical thinking, for instance, is a way of flexible thinking where you can see the conflicts, but you can also transcend them and see something positive. So positive and negative things are of course not like opposites. You can be both very worried and feel hopeless, hope at the same time.
Okay, great. Thank you, Maria. Okay, any questions from the floor or Vaisu? Yeah. I got a follow-up question. In fact, that we've been designing an intervention to see if positive or negative news in relation to climate change would have any impact on the attitude behavior of the young people in response to climate change. So do you have any specific advice as to how we incorporate positive, negative news or the content into the intervention?
I did a review study or a overview of hope research, and it's very difficult to do this kind of interventions because there are people that have tried and it often does not work. It could sometimes increase hope, but not behavioral intentions. So there is this kind of difficulties, and I actually don't know if you want to do this kind of short-term intervention, how to solve that problem. But of course, this complexity that you can actually focus on in a school context could be hard to include in intervention studies of different kinds, especially if you do strict experiments. But if you do quasi-experiment, more intervention studies, then it could be used. And then I would say that first talk about the feelings that young people have, and then start from that and turn it into their own kind of views of what are the possibilities and help them in the process. That I think would be the best way to do that.
Great, thank you, Maria. Okay, we got a question from Kelly.
Hello, hi. I mean, great talk. Thank you, Maria. And I love your work. And I was wondering, but when you were talking about the intervention studies, I was really interested in that because, one of the things that, I've tried in my research and colleagues have tried is to try to increase people's sense of efficacy about what they can do to address climate change or other environmental issues. And so I was wondering about, you've got some kind of very specific I guess, sort of beliefs or practices that are related to climate change outcomes. And sometimes you can find those things correlationally, but it can be really hard to move them around. And so what kinds of, if it's okay for you to sort of talk about it, what kinds of strategies could you use to try to, to change those kinds of beliefs or approaches or ways of thinking, I suppose?
Yeah, so these two ways of coping that I presented are actually common in other kinds of fields, and there are interventions in psychological research that could be rather effective regarding this, coming from cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance. But then you need to adjust it to this context. And of course, for instance, increase in dialectical thinking, there are some studies showing that if you include young people in more participatory processes where they work together with other people that are different, that could increase dialectical thinking. But it could also be to I think be aware of this way of thinking that we all have and start to kind of criticize it a little bit. Is it like that? Does everybody need to be involved in order for it to have an effect? Can we look at that thinking? And also to be aware that there are different ways of thinking and to test them out. Like, is this kind of something that could work for me? Could kind of change your way, and because you get really stuck when you use this black and white thinking, and to just get some information about other things could start to unstuck you in this way. So we are just in the planning phase of these interventions, so we still do not know exactly what we are going to do, but we have a lot of ideas at this stage. So hopefully there will be some study soon that are there.
Okay. Well,
I look forward to reading them.
yeah, me too. Okay, thank you so much again, Maria, for your great speech, and we love it. And so let's move on to our next speaker. Next speaker, Professor Boyi Yang. He will talk about green space and health benefits for Chinese population, evident from epidemiology studies. Professor Yan is a professor of environmental epidemiology and assistant to the Dean, School of Public Health, Sun Yat-sen University, China. His research focuses on green space and health, as well as the underlying mechanisms. So his talk highlights epidemiological evidence linking urban green space to health benefits in Chinese population. So let us invite Professor Yang.
Hi, Sam. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, very clear. Thank you.
Okay. I will check with you my slide is fine.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Now I will begin. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's start.
Okay. Yeah. Sam and everyone, good afternoon. Thank you very much and having me this very nice symposium. And today my talk is about green space and the health benefits for Chinese population. And I will report the evidence from some epidemiological studies. And first, I will show you some background of the green space. So, because I thought that this symposium focuses on the built environment, so green space may be very familiar for all of us. But in my study, I defined the green space as the lands or areas that are covered by vegetation, such as parks, forests, gardens, and street builds. This we define as green space. And this is a paper that was published in 2050 in Nature journal. And in this study, the authors estimated the number of trees that was existing since the human being existing in this earth until now. And this study showed that number of trees has reduced from 6,000 billion to about 3,000 billion from the appearance of human being on the earth to today. This means that half of the trees has been cut or used or destroyed by human beings. And this slide shows, the left sugar shows the picture of Shenzhen city in China that was in 1978, about 47 years ago. At that time, Shenzhen city is a very natural and a small village. But now, as the right figure shows, it's already a very big city. The city crowded by buildings. The very natural green space has been destroyed, and the people's access to green space also has reduced significantly. This is not only about Shenzhen city, it's about all of the city in China during the last 50 years. A very big change is that the green space coverage has reduced. We all know that green space may be beneficial to our human being, and there existing some potential mechanisms. For example, some studies show, evidence has shown that green space can reduce environmental hazards like reduce air pollution levels, reduce noise levels, and reduce heat waves. And also green space can encourage people to do more physical activity and reduce mental stress. And also including our research groups study, we recently found that green space can enrich microbiodiversity, air pollution, physical activity, mental stress, and microbiodiversity are also have been documented to be closely related to human health. So that's why green space can affect affect the people's health. Our group started to focus on the the study area since 2018. At that time, we found that most of the studies on green space and health were conducted in the European countries and North American countries. And nearly no human epidemiological studies were performed in China. So since then, our group performed a series of epidemiological studies. For example, we performed a cross-sectional study in 33 cities or 33 communities in northeast of China. In that study, we included about 25,000 adults, and we collected data on cardiovascular and metabolic indicators. And also in northeast of China, it's Liaoning province. We also performed another study in children population. In that study, we collected about 16,000 children. We collected data on metabolic indicators, allergic disease, and also other data. And there we also performed a cross-sectional study in 7 cities of China. The 7 cities covers most of the area that has the highest population density in China. We collected about 16,000 children, and we also collected data on metabolic indicators and myopia. And we also performed another study in Guangdong province. In this study, we performed a case control study. We collected data on maternal and their children, and we as a birth cohort study. And also we performed another study very northwest of China. It's in the Xinjiang province. There is a place called Kashgar city. In this city, we collected about 47,000 adults. We also focused on metabolic indicators. And we also performed another study in Guangzhou city, and we collected data on mental health. And this is most of the studies that we performed during the last 10 years. And based on this health data, we then estimated the green space exposures for the participants. We mainly used satellite images downloaded from some datasets and calculated some green space index such as NDVI, SAVI. NDVI is called the normalized the differences vegetation index, and SAVI is very similar index like NDVI, but additionally adjusting the bio-soil background. And we also calculated other greenness index. And based on the the participants' address, we matched the green space data with the health data that I just mentioned above, and then performed some data analysis to estimate the associations between green space and these health outcomes. And in addition to the this association, because we also collected data on air pollution and exercise, as I just mentioned before, because air pollution and exercise may be a pathway by which green space affect human health. So we also performed some mediation analysis to estimate the mediated effects of air pollution and exercise between green space and human health. Here is the results from the 33 communities study. We first explored the effects of green space on diabetes. And in this study, we found that the risk of diabetes mellitus reduced with the increase of greenness levels. And we also found that the glucose and insulin indexes also changed beneficially with the increase of green space levels. And this result shows that green space is beneficial for our glucose metabolism and the diabetes risk. And in the next study, next analysis, we estimated the greenness and the risk of hypertension. And expectedly, we also find that higher green space levels are associated with the lower blood pressure levels and lower hypertension prevalence. And next, we also performed analysis of greenness and blood lipids. And similarly, we found that higher greenness levels were associated with lower odds of dyslipidemias and better lipid profiles. Next, we also analyzed the green space levels and the odds of metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome is a cluster of several metabolic indicators such as diabetes, obesity, blood pressures, and blood lipids. And also similarly, we found beneficial association between them. And similarly, about the obesity, we also found that with the increase of residential greenness levels, the odds of obesity reduced. And also we estimated the green space there and the risk of cardiovascular disease prevalence, and found that with the increase of NDVI levels, the odds of cardiovascular disease substantially reduced. And the above results is we generated from the cross-sectional study that were performed in adult population, and also in the next childhood study that was performed in 7 cities in Liaoning and northeast part of China. In this study, we first estimated the school green space levels. That means green space surrounding schools and kindergartens and the odds of ADHD. And we also find that with the increase of greenness levels in the schools or kindergartens, the odds of childhood ADHD reduced. And we also estimate the risk of asthma and school greenness, and expectedly the risk of asthma reduced with the school greenness levels. But what is worth noting that the current literature on green space and asthma in other studies, in other populations that were, for example, other Chinese population or the population located in other regions or countries, they found that the evidence of greenness and asthma is not existent. For example, in some countries, they found that the greenness is positively associated with the risk of asthma, because greenness can release pollens, and pollens are risk factor for the asthma. So they reported some opposite with our study. And next, we also estimated the lung function, and found that with the greenness levels increased, the childhood lung function became better. And in this study, this is a relatively novel study that we estimated the association between green space and the myopia of the childhood. We also know that childhood myopia is a very severe public health problems in Asia countries, including in China, Singapore, Japan, Korea, and also some other Asian countries. And in this study of 7 cities, adult childhood participants, we estimated that with the increased levels of school greenness we found that the odds of myopia or visual impairment reduced greatly. It means that the school greenness is beneficial for people's eyesight. And based on all this study, we also explored the greenness at schools with the childhood adiposity, and also found beneficial association. And also we found beneficial association between school greenness and blood pressure in children. These are results that we generated from this childhood study. And in the study that were performed in very northwestern part of China, this is a region surrounded by deserts, and the green space levels is much lower. And so in this study, we also estimated the association of greenness and blood lipids and glucose and metabolic syndrome. And in this study, we found that the association between greenness and these metabolic indicators is relatively weak. This is mainly because of the quality of vegetation in these areas is not good enough. And in the Guangdong's birth cohort study, we estimated the maternal exposure to green space during pregnancy and the odds of congenital heart disease, CHD. And we found that with the increase of green space levels that were exposed by pregnant women, the risk of heavy CHD in offspring reduced gradually. And we also, based on the case control population of this case control study, we found that with the increase of green space levels, the risk of gestational diabetes in the pregnancy women reduced substantially. Okay, these are many results that were performed in China's Chinese populations. Besides this, we also used some open access data to explore the association between greenness and some disorders. For example, we used the GBD data that was covered nearly all the cultural elements of this world, and we found that the greenness levels in a country or a region was beneficially associated with the burdens of diabetes, although the significance was the association was not statistically significant. And next, we also collaborated with researchers from other countries and performed a multi-country study. In this study, we explored the green space levels and the human microbiota. And we found that with the increase of greenness levels, the biodiversity or diversity of microbiota in human beings, such as the gut microbes and skin microbes, decreased significantly, especially some beneficial species. I mean that the beneficial species is some microbe that were beneficial to our health. And this study is important because we not only documented the association between greenness and human microbiota, but it also gives some insights on the potential mechanisms by which greenness affect human health, because we know that human microbe has been closely related to our human health. And next, we also use the Chinese government census data that were performed in 2000, 2010, and almost 2020. And we found that in this study, we explored the association between green space explorer and mortality all over China. And we also found that the people living in greener areas, they have the lower odds of death. This is another study that was performed in northwest of China that is a very large, very big cohort study. In that study, we used outdoor environmental exposure. In that study, we estimated 40 environmental exposures and estimated the associations to be the burden of tuberculosis. And we also found that green space levels is beneficial to the risk of tuberculosis. So it means that green space can protect from TB. Besides some these primary studies that we performed, our research group also wrote some systematic reviews. And in this review, we summarized all the evidence that were concerns green space levels and human health, and we used the umbrella review approach. And in this study, we also reviewed the green space and the overweight and obesity. And this systematic review is much earlier. And we also estimated the green space and cardiovascular disease. And very recently, we also, this study we collaborated with the SAM. And we also estimate the credibility of the evidence of green space and human health. We performed the overview of meta-analysis and use a gradient approach to rank the credibility of the existing evidence. This study was published in 2023. Finally, we provide a pyramid of the evidence concerning all green space and human health. And we found that for interventional studies, the rank of the evidence like this for VOBs, for effects, their association with the green space has been ranked as a moderate level evidence. And for other health outcomes, their credibility was very low or very low. And for observational studies, we only find that the association between green space and CVD mortality is at the highest level, is cohesive. But for our other health outcomes, they ranked as highly suggestive or weak. And till now, as I just mentioned, our group was much earlier studying the studies in mainland China in 2018. And till now, there has been many studies estimating the association of green space and human health in China. So last year, we also wrote a book that collected all the evidence that performed in Chinese population. And this book has also been published very recently. Okay, above is all the results I want to report today. And in addition, I want to highlight that the green space and as well as the green policies has been very focused both by government and local departments, and not only in China but also other countries. They both focus on the green policies may be beneficial for people's health and also beneficial for ecology balance and other aspects. Okay, the above is what I want to talk today, and thanks for your listening. And I'm very looking forward to collaborating with you, including Sam and other researchers. Okay, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Boyi, for your great speech, and with lots of evidence demonstrating the linkage between greenness and health across different dimensions. It's great. Let me start with the first question. So I'm very interested in researching the connection between greenness and health and well-being. So you mentioned a number of studies connecting greenness to residential greenness to health, and also you connecting greenness surrounding school with health. Yeah, because for the young people, for the school children, they may spend, I think, a significant amount of time at home and also at school. So I was wondering, the greenness as near school or the greenness near home or at home would be more important in relative terms.
Excuse me, you mean the association between them or the
Yes,
mixed
just
or
to
something?
see the effects of greenness and surrounding school versus at the resident, which is more important in terms of contributing health and well-being.
Okay, I think for young children, school greenness is more important than residential greenness for children, especially in China. We all know that children's daily life, they studied and lived at school for most of the daily time. And so they most use the school greenness more frequently. And after school, when they go back to home, they have less time to go outside, especially we know that they have a lot of, especially for senior students, they have a lot of homework to do. So they will have very less opportunity to use their residential green space. And also for some students, we all know that they not only study, they live in the school. They only went back to home at weekend for 1 day or half a day. So greenness for school greenness is more important for the students. And the question is that we recently estimating the green space levels in schools, in many schools in mainland China. We also compared the school greenness levels with in Chinese schools with other countries. We found that in Asian areas, the green space coverage in schools is very low. So this is actually is a question that should be paid more attention to by the government or some departments to solve.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that this would be interesting to compare the effect on the school student in China as compared to other countries to see if it also applies to the school children in other countries. Okay, let me open the floor. We still have a minute or two to see if there are any quick questions from the audience on site or live Zoom. Okay, thank you so much, Boyi, for your inspiring speech. Okay, so now we can move on to the next speaker. So next speaker, we have Manh-Toan Ho from Vietnam, and his speech is navigating a sustainable future from video games to pro-environmental behavior. Manh-Toan Ho is the Vice Director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Social Research at Phrenica University, Hanoi, Vietnam. His research focuses on how video games influence and can address environmental challenges. So his talk explores how green gaming, from educational tools to environmental narratives, can drive environmental engagement and sustainable practices with insights from player behavior analysis and economic models. I think that would be very interesting, especially many of our kids are playing games online or other ways. Okay, let's pass the floor to Manh-Toan Ho.
Hello, nice to meet everyone, and thank you all the previous speaker for delivering such a exciting talk and topics. And for me, I would like to share a bit with you through my talk today about the hidden connection between video game and environment. And in this talk, I'd like to share a bit, to review a bit some of the mainline research regarding video game and environment, and also sharing some of the finding in my own research as well. So let's start okay. So I think when you buy a new iPhone today, you would probably recognize that they no longer have the charger within it. And when Apple did this in 2020, they cited the reason as they want to reduce the packaging so they can reduce the transportation cost and therefore saving environment. whether this is true or not is up to debate, but I think it's one of the ways that we can recognize the electric and digital good have been paying more attention to the environmental impact. Even as recently, with the rise of artificial intelligence, the Vietnam News also shares some information about the carbon footprint of artificial intelligence. So how about one of the largest entertainment industry in the world with in terms of money? The market is up to almost 2 billion, with a lot of people, with more than 3 billion active gamer, as well as a lot of time. A single game can generate up to 3 billion hours of entertainment each month, in comparison to normal TV show can only produce up to 75 or 80 hours in total. So with video games, first, when they are still a physical media, there's a lot of worry about the use of plastic in packaging, and also the electronic waste. As far back as in 1983, there are 700,000 cartridges were dumped as landfill in America, and this was one of the biggest incident of environmental impact that early for the video game industry. Later, recently, game have moving toward a digital storefront where game can be bought and download online, and people stay online more for playing video games. So the energy consumption and the carbon footprint of the ever online connectivity have become the new worry for video game industry. In order to address some of this worry through game journalism and through official initiative like Playing for Planet from United Nations, video game industry have started to find a way to raise awareness and to address some of the environmental concern. From the research community, one of the notable line of research is green gaming study, which mostly from based on the theory from the media study and traditional humanities study. There have been a lot of terms that have been used to describe the green gaming, such as eco game, climate game, or ecological games. One of the notable definitions is by Colin Minburn. He in a way categorized the video game in terms of gameplay and narrative into various types of environmental discipline, control, and responsibility. In a way, this traditional video game study tried to find the environmental meaning of video games. Aside from that, there's also another line of research, which is the serious game, which is a game that have been built and designed exclusively for environmental purpose. And this line of research have been used a lot in various fields like architecture or education. It's more like a tool to foster environmental awareness. And of course, video game as a technological research also receive a lot of attention from computer science, in which they try to find the solution and try to find technological advancement to have the game run more efficient and greener. One of the project, one of the famous serious game can be found in the title called Ego. Is interestingly, in the advertisement, they were advertised as educational tools, and in fact, it was built under the funding from U.S. Department of Education. Some researchers call it a digital simulated ecosystem. So through playing this game, player can learn to learn about the environment and also learn about the danger of exploiting environment. Aside from serious game, another aspect that that interesting is the finding the educational value in the popular games. Like there's a title called Red Dead Redemption 2 or Animal Crossing. Red Dead Redemption 2 is a open world game in which the world is the simulation of the 18th century American. And in this game, researchers have found that like when players go out in the game trying to catch some fish, they can actually learn and remember the name, the habitat, and even the sound of the fish after playing a lot in this game. In my own research as well, and in 2020, when I conduct a survey of Animal Crossing, it's a live simulated games from Nintendo. We found that the player really like to simulate and redesign the islands in natural or natural related themes when they have a chance to redesign the islands where the game is happening. In this survey, I also try to find the correlation between the in-game behavior and real-life environmental perception, which I find is often contradictory. We believe this is due to the simplicity of the game design in which the natural environment is often be portrayed as unlimited resource. And in order to complete the game, you just have to keep on exploiting the resource. And this is also one of the most common criticism regarding the interactivities of the environment in video games. I think one of the most important contribution of the game study is to the concept of playing, because when I say I am playing video games, it's very different from like I say I am reading a book, because if I say I read a book, you can understand easily. But when I say I play games, it could mean that I am playing chess, or I'm fishing in a game, or like I'm shooting someone in a virtual environment. So in a way, the game study try to redefine the concept of play and try to find the new way that we can design and formulate a better way to improve the representation and the interaction of the player in the virtual environment, and also finding a way to better deliver a meaningful environmental narrative to the player. And one of the such chance is in a way of how we think about the video game and the video game industry at large. So there's a reason, more recently, there are more research have been moving away from focusing on the video game, which is the final product, but on the whole process of the game and before and after the game is released, such as for the developer of how to create, how to have a better game design, for regulator, for publisher, or even for player on different approach to playing. In one of the notable study in 2018, Evan Mills and college actually try to measure the amount of energy consumption that the game system actually required, a different combination of the gaming system required. And an interesting result is that they found almost no technical research, no labeling program, no regulation or policy regarding the energy use of gaming hardware, at least in the context of study, which is in the US. And for a more contextual study, recent study also try to estimate the amount of carbon emission and energy consumption of playing game, for developing game is estimated to be around 0.0% of 4% of world emission. For buying a game, the physical game is estimated to be around 2.49 kilograms of CO2 equivalent, while the digital is less with 0.8 to 5 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. And the act of playing game in overall is estimated to be around 18.6 million tons of CO2 equivalent. In my own research, I also found that there is no, the existing law, at least, there's no mention of video game or environmental protection regarding to the digital industry. There's only a new recent draft law that have been incentivized business to promote the environmentally friendly oriented product and service. But the law has not been implemented yet. In talking with the game developer myself, there is a common perception that the video game industry is essentially a software production. So there is the impact on the environment is unclear to the developers themselves. It's hard for the developer to see the environmental impact. However, society-wide, there are certain activities being promoted, such as reuse, reduce, recycle, or energy saving through events like Earth Hour. So in a way, within the office setting, there are some environmentally friendly behavior are being promoted. And also from a practical perspective, saving electricity, also saving costs. And given that a lot of game studios are being operated like a startup, it's important for them to save the money and try to survive for as long as possible in the industry. But some developers believe that even as a software product, they can actually try to make the game run better, and in a way with that they can indirectly help the software to last longer and to increase the energy consumption of the hardware. So in general, the game developers still largely believe that games are for fun, and at least in a community like in Vietnam, game with specific purpose sometimes are not seen as game. They see it as more like a gamification, which is the common, like Duolingo. They just use the game feature in a not game setting to help with engaging the customer. And actually in Vietnam, the game company are being contracted to work on some of this gamification projects. So what they can do from the developers themselves, I think is they believe that we need a better indicator of what it means to be good for the environment, and also a clear law and regulation for them to follow. And finally, I think there is always room for some industry-wide initiative, event, workshop, or guidelines to raise and promote the environmental awareness. And in the study from Mill 2018, he suggests that gaming should be seen as an activity that involves a combination of both hardware, software, and user behavior, rather than an isolated device. And I think that green gaming as well should also be seen as a comprehensive activities with a very purchasing and consumption of both hardware and software for video games, not only the game themselves. And this is a very new and an idea that I would like to work on in the future and continue to work on. So that should be the end of my talk. Thank you for listening.
Okay, great, wonderful. Thank you so much, Mentor, for your inspiring sharing, especially that I think most of us like gaming or gamification one way or another. Yeah, just not to project it, only young people like gaming. Otherwise, it would be a bit of a bias. And yeah, I'm very interested in involving games or game feature in communicating climate change or educating for the kids especially. In fact, one of my project that we are working on, we are developing online games, very simple one, targeting kindergarten kids and also primary school kids. So we would like to engage them to play the games, having some fun. Along the way, they learn more about the nature, environment, and the native species, and some interesting species or feature, so that they help to cultivate a love for environment in the first place. Yeah, I think this is very important, especially that if we want them to protect our nature, protect environment, they got to develop a love for the nature. Yeah, otherwise they won't care so much about the damage on the environment. Okay, Kelly, you raise your hand.
Thanks so much. I was really looking forward to hearing this talk because I think it's such a fascinating topic. And of course, you know, you've approached it from two different kind of angles, the sort of notion of how you can be a green gamer, but also that notion of using games to try to, you know, like maybe raise awareness or educate people about climate change and environment. And I suppose, I hope this is a question, not a comment. I suppose what strikes me is that people play games to have fun and to escape, right? They're a form of escapism, I think, in large part. And so trying to, and I think the point you made about how if you try to make them sort of educational, that's not a game, that's sort of gamification. But so I wonder, you know, so I'm thinking that the only way that it could really effectively work as a game is essentially if the environment or climate change is something kind of subtly. It's like it's a subtle element or theme or aspect of the game, so that people get drawn into it and it's fun and it's a game, and they're not kind of getting beaten over the head by thinking that they're playing a climate change game. Because let's face it, anything that gets advertised as a climate change game is probably not going to run off the shelves, right? Because people are going, oh, I don't really want to spend my, you know, I don't want to do my escapism, you know, in such a kind of serious and sort of depressing topic. So I suppose So up to this point, comment, the question to you is, has anyone tried to do that? Are there existing games where they're trying to kind of weave in those environmental themes? I know you mentioned some, and you know, I didn't kind of catch the details, you know, where they're trying to sort of be subtle about the way that they put those themes into the games.
Yes, that is very, I think it's an interesting observation. Actually, I think one of the, as you said, it's hard to make people buy the game if they know it's like, okay, this is about the climate change and this is about this. So, and I think the criticism from the researcher themselves is that, like, for the game like that, for the game that assess specifically about about something about climate change, for instance, they don't actually utilize the aesthetic of video game enough to accommodate for. And actually, researchers have also think about there have been some game that more about exploration of the environment. There are still the sense of mystery there, but they for researchers, they call it a non-violent way to engage with the environment. Like the environment have to be not like the resource that you can exploit, but it's have to be designed to be something else. And there are some work that have pointing this out, but I think overall it's really up to the designer and what is their intention to the game, because like sometimes it's the environment is just the background, and sometimes it's need to be more, but the design is hard. The design is and I think one of the renowned researcher Alenda Cheng suggests that game is like a biological research. Like you section off a part of the reality and you try to experiment within the element within that. It's like a fish tank where different element is available to you within the framework, so you have to work with that. So I think there are some titles that I would like to share for sure, and there have been some progress to a better representation. Yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, just to see if there are any questions from the floor via Zoom. So, Manh-Toan, what do you recommend? So, should we play more games, or should we design more games to combat climate change?
I think first we should consume better. I think we should try to at least personally, I try to not buying use more digital game, of course, and also if you need to spend on some hardware, try to find the secondary one, second-hand use, so like you can reduce some costs as well. And I believe that we should all try to design better games and having a more especially in terms of like expansive open world type of game, in which like gamer can actually spend days there, like interacting with the environment with complex physics system. I think those games can actually be a good chance to to help us learn about how the impact that we can have on the environment generally.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you again, Manh-Toan, for your interesting talk. And thank you so much again for our 4 speaker this afternoon in Hong Kong. And we have a very interesting discussion on environment, health, and sustainability. So I hope this is just the beginnings of our exchanges and discussion, and let's connect, and then we can talk more, and hopefully we could develop some collaboration in the long run. And also thanks again for all the participants on site and online, and we will see you soon. Okay, have a nice day, everyone. Cheers.
Thanks very much, Sam. It's great to meet you all.
Very much, Sam. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.